I want to start by saying that I'm not here to condemn any of you for your political or socioeconomic opinions. I come to you as a fallen human being who sees an injustice and strives for a resolution. Despite racism having become a polarized topic in recent discussions, I would ask you that you set aside any predispositions or assumptions you might have about this topic. My goal isn't to claim that those who are oppressed are without fault. But what I am saying is that those who hold higher powers and oppress others should be stopped. I'm here to argue that racial discrimination has been present in the criminal justice system in as recent as the last 40 years. This is evident through the war on drugs and how this has formed racial bias policies and opinions of American citizens. But lastly, I'd like to examine an ancient political, theological view of justice to further prove that African American men have been treated unjustly in this country. It goes without saying that America has had its heavy share of racial discrimination. In the early 20th century, African Americans who were convicted under the justice system were tried harshly. They were set against incompetent lawyers, high bail, all-white juries, and weak evidence. They stood no chance against the system who wanted to eradicate them because of their race. Thankfully, today, socially and politically, things have changed. However, mass incarceration might suggest that there is still prevalent racial discrimination in the current criminal justice system. Since 1926, the prison population has been dutifully recorded. And in 1977, the prison population was 285,566 individuals. Today, over 2 million and counting individuals are currently incarcerated. Of these incarcerated people, almost 50% are people of color, making African Americans 37% of those who are incarcerated. Meanwhile, Anglo-Americans only make up 40% of the incarcerated. This, in the last 40 decades, means that we've had a 500% increase in incarcerations in just 4 decades. With such high statistics of imprisonment, every 1 in 3 African American men today are expected to serve some time in prison. Meanwhile, Anglo males are expected, every 1 in 17 Anglo men are expected to serve some form of time in prison. So where did it all begin? Unfortunately, Richard Nixon, in his presidential campaign, saw the African vote as a threat, being that they tended to vote democratically because the Democrats were more in favor of favoring their civil liberties. He also saw that he needed to gain the white middle-class vote in order to outshine the African American vote. The way that he successfully did this was by issuing the war on drugs. In short, he basically made drugs appear as a bigger issue in America than they actually were. This political tactic to appear tough on crime snowballed. And in the Reagan administration, he's known for issuing the Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the Military Enforcement Cooperation Act in law enforcement. What the Anti-Drug Abuse Act allowed was capital punishment for severe drug offenses and a 5-year mandatory minimum for first-time offenders of having as little as 5 grams of crack cocaine. The Military Enforcement Act in law enforcement then allowed for militarized weapons to be used in law enforcement in order to prevent drug trafficking. Next, we have Clinton. He's notoriously known for spending $17.8 billion in prison building and prevention programs because he saw this as a continuing issue. And instead of trying to fix the problem socially, he thought that the better option was just to assume that this is going to get worse and worse and build more prisons. So then how do these policies disproportionately affect African American men? Well, I've already stated that the Anti-Drug Abuse Act called for capital punishment in a mandatory minimum of 5 years. But get this, you will be sent to prison for 5 years for having 5 grams of crack cocaine, and you will get the same time for having as much as 500 grams of powder cocaine. Now, to the uninformed person, many may not know that crack cocaine is notoriously known for being used predominantly by African Americans. 1, because it was cheaper. 2, because you could vaporize it and get a higher, more intense, shorter though, high. Meanwhile, powder cocaine was more expensive and also notoriously known to be used by Anglo-Americans. This is known as the 100-to-1 ratio. Fortunately, in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act was passed. What this did was reduce the ratio from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1, also allowing for more lenient sentences for first-time offenders and more punitive sentences for those who are drug traffickers. How then has the war on drugs and these policies continued to affect the opinion of the African American citizen? One phenomenon, psychologically and socially, to explain this is known as attribution theory. In attribution theory, you have your in-group and your out-group. The in-group in this situation would be the Anglo-Americans, and the out-group would be the African Americans. What the in-group does is clan together and segregate, excluding people that aren't similar to them. Thus, in a sense, this allows for stereotypes to prosper and for systematic racism. A study that might explain this is in Southern California, 96 Anglo college students were asked to observe actors. These actors, one was African American and one was Anglo. However, they didn't know that they were actors. The situation at hand was that these one African American and one Anglo man were having a discussion which became more heated and heated, which initiated in one of the individuals pushing the other. When the African American was seen as the aggressor, 76% of these 96 observers saw him as being overly aggressive. Meanwhile, only 14% saw that when the white was the aggressor, that he was being overly aggressive. Furthermore, 6% saw that the African American individual, as the aggressor, was playing around, but 42% saw that the Anglo man was only playing around and dramatizing. Furthermore, how do Anglo views on crime in African Americans support punitive policies? Well, another survey in California was done, in which the scholar wanted to connect these two. She did this by asking a group of randomized Anglo-Americans to rate how they felt about African Americans on a 1 to 5 scale, whether that was they're lazy, they're their own problems, or they're the oppressed, or they're the ones who are being wronged. What she found was that higher rates of symbolic racism correlated with higher rates of punitive policies, support thereof of punitive policies. So what is symbolic racism then? Well, symbolic racism is a modern term coined to explain negative Anglo prejudiced views against African Americans. And then what are punitive policies? Punitive policies are strict, harsh, unforgiving policies that are used to sentence drug offenders. So what is justice? And how do we go about defining it? St. Thomas Aquinas defines it as a cardinal virtue. And cardinal virtues are used to achieve ultimate happiness in society. He gives us 2 points then to further practice justice in the right sense. The first being that punishment is for the restoration of order when a sin is committed. Meaning that if we're over-penalizing and setting back a minority who's already economically disproportionately disadvantaged, then we are doing them an injustice. Secondly, punishment demands satisfaction for the sin. Again, over-penalizing is not justice. In fact, it is an injustice. Given America's tendency to fall back into racial caste systems, be that intentionally or unintentionally, we must carefully question what the media is telling us, what our politicians are saying, and most importantly, listening to those who are calling out for help, or speaking for those who don't have a voice. The criminal justice system, through political ideals, has stigmatized an already marginalized group. Enough is enough, and I'd like to remind you that this is more than a presentation, more than a paper, and more than a grade. It's about those who have been wronged in our country due to white oppressors. What I'd like this to be is a wake-up call to those of higher power, to those of higher socioeconomic powers, to listen to those that are calling for change in our society due to a history of systematic racism. Enough is enough, and the longer we take to realize the issue, the bigger it gets. Thank you.